I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, war never changes, and unfortunately that's completely right. War is one of those things that seems almost innately human, something that is so ingrained and involved in our society that it can be traced back thousands of years. But when did war start? Today we're going to be discussing the oldest evidence of war ever found. And I would like to preface for all of you who've been watching my videos for a while that this one's going to be a little bit more serious than the others. So massive trigger warning for violence, warfare, and everything that goes with it. If those are things that make you uncomfortable, please click off the video now. For those of us that are left, let's get into the story. This story takes place in Natarak, Namibia. What you see here is the remains of an ancient lake bed. At the end of the Pliocene epoch, this had been a lake, and a very desirable location to build a settlement, as it could provide the locals with fish and fresh water. But upon excavation of this location, little evidence was found to shed light upon a peaceful past. In the ancient lake sediments, archaeologists found the remains of 27 human beings. The question, of course, immediately arose of how old they were, and through the processes of radiocarbon dating and lake bed stratigraphy, archaeologists were able to determine that these remains were about 10,000 years old. But immediately they could tell that this was no normal burial. It was deduced that these remains had not been buried, but rather that they had had time to decompose. And by looking at these remains with relation to the sediments within the lake, they were able to determine that the bodies had been deposited within its waters shortly after their deaths. But upon exhumation of the remains, archaeologists were able to determine even more. Of the remains, 21 of them were adults. 8 of these adults were male, while 8 were female, and the others were impossible to tell. And the remaining 6 skeletons were of children. 10 out of the 12 complete skeletons showed evidence of incredibly violent ends. 71251 was found alongside 2 remains of microlithics. Microlithics is archaeology for small stones, and these were interpreted as being arrowheads. He had 1 lodged in his cranium and 1 in his leg. And I will only listen to 1 arrow to the knee joke before I start losing my shit. Skeleton 1253 was hit in the face with a blunt object, and he was then stabbed in the back of the neck with a sharp instrument. Skeleton 1254 was female, and showed evidence of injuries on her arm, possibly from either blocking a blow or from falling. It is likely that she met her end with a blow to the face due to her fractured jawbone. 1256 was also female, and met her end with a projectile to the back. 1263 was male, and took a blow to the face and a projectile to the back of the head. And the image I showed you earlier is skeleton number 1264. And as much as we'd like to think that this crack on his skull was from his years in the sediment, this was unfortunately how he met his end. And the last one, which I don't even want to look for a picture of, is probably the most tragic. And that is skeleton 1255, and she was in the late stages of her pregnancy. Her hands were bound behind her back before she was executed. I cannot even fathom what would prompt a human being to commit this act of barbarity. And the problem is we will never know. The motives and reasoning behind this massacre has been lost to time. We know that the people involved carried blunt instruments, which are likely not hunting weapons, and they used obsidian-tipped arrows, which is a resource that is found nowhere in this area, implying that the attackers came from a great ways. We likely will never know what happened here, but I'd like to try and remind you of something. When looking at images like this, remember that this was a human being, just like you and I, but so were the monsters that did this.